so we can get Bill up on screen. Yeah. And then we'll turn it over to Bill here.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm so glad to be a part of your meeting today and have this opportunity to meet, at least virtually, more of you that I haven't already met. And so, as you heard, I've worked a long time in accessibility and minimum standards or guidelines for accessibility in recreation facilities. I'm a white male with blonde hair, and I'm wearing a kind of a red and gray plaid shirt today. But the one thing that you can't see is that I'm also a person that uses a manual wheelchair. And in 1983, I was involved in a motor vehicle accident where I was ejected from the vehicle because I wasn't wearing a safety belt. And as a result of that, it severed my spinal cord very high in my chest. And so I'm a high-level paraplegic. And um, at the time, I was living in central Kansas, and really struggled to find opportunities to just even get to the grocery store or pump my own gas or get in and out of a vehicle. It took me several years before I could drive again. But what I really found out very quickly is that without an ADA standards at that time in 1983, the access to even be a pedestrian was unavailable in the small community that I lived in. Things that we take for granted now, like a curb ramp, were just not available. Um, so I was very fortunate to go through the vocational rehabilitation process and get to go to the University of Kansas and then move on to graduate school at the University of Washington to promote access originally in arenas and stadiums. I was hired to come to Washington, D.C. to work with a large facility management organization that made arenas and stadiums more accessible after the implementation of the ADA in 1990. We're coming up on 35 years of that civil rights law. So I came to Washington, D.C. to start working on accessibility for arenas and stadiums, but soon found myself being employed by the U.S. Access Board in Washington, D.C. And the U.S. Access Board's a very small independent federal agency that writes the minimum accessibility guidelines that then are adopted by the Department of Justice in the case of the facilities that you're running. Title II facilities are covered by the ADA. And the Department of Justice is your standard setting agency. So they adopt these minimum guidelines from the U.S. Access Board. And then once they're adopted by the Department of Justice and gone through their rulemaking process, they become what we know as the standard or Code of Federal Regulations. And the state of Minnesota has adopted a model building code that mirrors the accessibility requirements in the ADA. And so the requirements that I'm talking about, that standard, in 2004, the Access Board completed those minimum guidelines that became the enforceable standard and are called the 2010 ADA Standards for Accessible Design. I'm hoping that's not new information for you. But it put in a series of implementation dates, and it said that anything constructed or altered after March 15th of 2012 would be required to comply with these new standards. And those new standards for the first time included recreation facilities, 8 different sections: amusement rides, boating, fishing facilities, golf and miniature golf, sports facilities, play areas, which I think is one of the most important areas that we inserted there, but also swimming pools, wading pools, and spas. Those were inserted into that 2010 ADA standards. But what I'd like to say is that since 1990, your facilities have had the obligation to make sure that their programs and services and facilities are accessible to, and the most important part, usable by people with disabilities. And so even though there wasn't specific requirements, those that I just spoke to you about in Chapter 10, now recreation facilities, that there was this ongoing obligation to make sure that your facilities do provide opportunities for people of all ages and people of all abilities all the time. And so these specific requirements now lead us into those minimum design requirements that so far I've been working with your commission with to try to understand, because, not everything's spelled out in black and white, right? There's a lot of interpretation with these requirements. And then there's a lot of times facilities that incorporate a lot of these different unique facilities, but even more, right, include things like maybe a dog park or a frisbee golf course, things that weren't specifically addressed by these standards, but still have an obligation to make sure that they comply to the best of their ability, right, in all new construction or alterations of these facilities. I would just like to say that whenever you go into an alteration process, what you touch has to be fixed to be brought into compliance if you don't already have that same type of program available for people with disabilities to be able to participate in. So I would think just the standard you'd want to look at is that anything you touch, you're going to fix and bring into compliance. But that all new construction hopefully will go beyond these minimum requirements that are just that. I like to tell people that these minimum requirements are barely a C, really a D. You passed, but you didn't do anything special. So how do we make sure our facilities are beyond accessible, right? How do we make sure that they're beyond the minimum level of accessibility, but incorporate the opportunity to be inclusive? That multi-generational, multi-ability opportunity for the community that you're serving to be able to participate in these outdoor activities. I told you that when I first broke my back in 1983, there wasn't the opportunity to even get on a sidewalk, to be a pedestrian. And now we're talking about things like fishing and boating and the opportunity to get out and recreate with your family, with your friends. And that inclusion of people with disabilities is what I'm here to help the commission with. As I shared with you, I'm a person with a disability. I have a family. I'm an outdoors person. I actually was born in Minnesota, in Fridley, Minnesota, in 1958. And then my family moved to Kansas, where they had a large farm, and it was near there where I broke my back. Um, so I just wanted to let you know about that process, but then also what I hopefully will have an opportunity to help be more inclusive in the facilities that you're working with, designing, constructing, or altering, to make sure that we go beyond just that minimum level of accessibility. We plan for the future. These facilities that we're constructing will take decades to replace. And we don't want to have to think about once they're newly constructed, did we meet those minimum requirements? We want to say we exceeded those minimum requirements, and we provide inclusion for everyone to be able to come and participate. So that U.S. Access Board here in Washington, D.C. is a really small federal agency that writes those minimum guidelines, not only under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also what we call the Architectural Barriers Act that applies to all federal lands. And so if maybe you had a state park that was on federal land, maybe a Corps of Engineers or something like that, there would be application for that accessibility law as well. When we talk about the Architectural Barriers Act and what it applies to on federal lands, the standard for recreation facilities has gone beyond what the Americans with Disabilities Act has incorporated. In 2013, I was the lead staff person for a rule that was called the Outdoor Developed Areas Final Rule. And I'm hoping, again, that's not something new to you to hear, but it went in under only the Architectural Barriers Act for federal lands. It is a best practice for facilities, Title II, state and local government facilities at this time, but not a standard. Again, remember your facilities have to be accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. So how do we do that when we have a picnic facility or a camping facility or maybe a pedestrian trail or a shared use path, maybe a viewing area or a beach access? How do we make sure that we meet at least those minimums? Well, we follow the requirements that are for those on federal lands to make sure that we meet those minimum requirements for state and local governments. So we look to that as a best practice. So that is where you would have maybe some application of looking at the Architectural Barriers Act. The U.S. Access Board has a website that is your one-stop shop for resource information, whether it be technical assistance guides or seeing the standard, the 2010 ADA standard for accessible design, or if you're looking for the Architectural Barriers Act and those best practices to follow when we're talking picnic, camping, pedestrian trails, viewing areas, and beach access routes. Very important. It's the website is access-board.gov. And even on the homepage, if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there's a series of animations that could help you with toilet and bathing facilities, with sales and service counters, with parking facilities, a level of animations that have been produced to kind of feed you the accessibility requirements in more of a visual content. When I was at the Access Board, I served there for 22 years. And I had the great opportunity to not only be an accessibility specialist, but lead the technical assistance operations for the Access Board, but also be their training coordinator, and developed a lot of webinars that are still on their website that are available free of charge. Many of them, they still offer ongoing continuing education credits, self-paced, so you can take a webinar on each one of the 10 chapters of the 2010 ADA standards, and then take the little post test and qualify for continuing education credits as a self-paced opportunity. I did webinars on most of the facilities that are covered in recreation, and also in the outdoor developed area final rule, and all available free of charge for you to watch a 90-minute webinar on the content of that information. Might be the easiest way to absorb it fast. I did want to say too that not only am I going to have the opportunity to help the commission with just looking at some plans or future projects and providing some input, but also we're going to be holding a series of forums. And we've already set dates for the two first forums for February 18th and April 15th. And we'll be talking about subjects that hopefully will help you better understand these minimum requirements and how to exceed them in the types of facilities that you're building, whether it be a play area, it be a trail, it be a swimming pool, or whatever it might be, that hopefully these public forums will not only give you a chance to hear from me specifically about those requirements, but again, ask questions. That, I think, Renee, is kind of where you were hoping that I'd bring this, and then maybe have an opportunity if people in your audience today have a question they'd like to ask me.
Thanks, Bill. Definitely. Does anyone have any questions? Now is a great time because we do have about 20 minutes with Bill, and he is, as you've heard already, a wealth of information. So, Jim.
I'm looking for that link for those webinars. I think that'd be real helpful.
Sure. The link for the webinar, I heard that question. So when you go to the U.S. Access Board's website, remember it was access-board.gov, and there's a toolbar across the top, and you go to the toolbar called Services, and there'll be a drop-down menu for trainings and webinars under Services. So that's where you'll find the link of archived webinars, and also they hold a monthly webinar that's free of charge, continuing educations every month. And whether it's on facility access or Section 508, I mean, that's another issue we haven't talked about, but making sure that the information you provide on your websites and the printed materials or the materials that you disseminate are all compliant to make sure that persons that are low vision or blind or deaf or hard of hearing still have the same opportunity to get that information. And how are you conveying that? So again, access-board.gov, the toolbar across the top, you go to Services, and there'll be a drop-down menu that allows you to get to trainings, webinars. And from there, you can go to the archived webinar list to see the self-paced webinars, or also just the archives of all the recreation facility webinars.
Other questions? Great opportunity. Yes, even something specific towards your facilities or ways you're thinking about how you can position yourself as an agency towards better services. Yeah, let's get the microphone over to her so Bill can hear it.
Just wondering about where the forums, is it February 18 and April 15? Those forums, are they in person? Are they virtual? They will be online. So those forums that Bill is going to be speaking at, we're going to have one approximately every quarter. And we're working with our partners at GMPT, Greater Minnesota Parks and Trails, to promote those. They'll also be on our website. There's going to be a link on that. I think there might already be. So those will be virtual. And the first two, as Bill was mentioning, playgrounds and maintenance. The next one is shared use paths. We don't have the next 2 quarters, third and fourth yet.
the point was we want to get your feedback. So obviously there's a lot of different needs and wants about what we all have to learn or could learn more about. So as we get past those first one, we'll start asking for some feedback about what would be helpful to all of you for the third and fourth quarters. It's meant to be as helpful as possible. And one of the things that we do have Bill available for, and he's already done, is worked with one of our facilities who had some questions about access, ADA access. He was extremely helpful. That was Stearns County, and came up with something out of the box that we weren't thinking of. So Bill is that wealth of information that we want to make available to all of you to help you get to that point. As Bill said, you know, we're a C maybe. We always say we want you to exceed those standards, but if we're not all familiar with what the basic standards are, it's hard to work to exceed them. So that's what having Bill available to us means. Gina?
Thanks, Renee. Hi, Bill. I guess my question would be, is not more of a question, but an inquiry about making our interpretive opportunities more accessible in terms of culture, limited visibility, hearing, all of those things.
Bill, did you
Renee,
catch that?
Renee, could you repeat the question for me?
Yes. How can we make our facilities more culturally available, particularly to the hard of hearing and sight impaired?
Yeah. So in terms of like educational signage or interpretive features, where we're trying to provide educational opportunities.
Yeah, that's really, one of the things is to think about programmatically how we make sure that everybody can participate. And I like to go back to the idea that those that you're trying to serve have the best knowledge, right? The community that you're serving and the people in that community are your resource. And I would advocate that you work with local community groups that support or advocate on behalf of those type of individuals to come in and give you some feedback. Talk with your staff about what would be helpful. Learn from those that have already experienced your facility. Maybe do a checklist, not maybe a checklist, but maybe a survey after, if people would fill it out when they leave your facility. Because you're specifically interested in certain information to try to help, these populations or user groups to participate. And I think, how you wayfind through the facility, you can think of, 3D modeling is really gotten a lot cheaper now that we can 3D print, right? So you could actually do a 3D model of your facility if it's very large to try to give somebody with low vision or that's blind from maybe your visitor center or out there at the site arrival point, like a parking lot. How could we let them know where things are located on the site tactily so that they get the lay of the land or understand direction and what's available? Things like that might be an opportunity to provide information for low vision or blindness. But I think the best thing I could offer you in that case would be really think about the population we're serving and who it would be the resources in your community to help facilitate that walkthrough or that interaction, whether it be on a Saturday or an off day during the week or something like that, that you could host some of that for your staff to learn and those organizations to provide that valuable feedback.
Thanks, Bill. Anyone else? This is now a great opportunity for any questions about your facility specifically or generally.
Thanks, Renee. Bill, really glad to have you on the session this morning. I get a little bit more on the technical side of making sure our construction drawings kind of work and meet ADA requirements, and there's always like gray areas. I'm just curious on your experience on what are some of the gray areas of the technical design that you're hearing that needs a little bit more clarity.
I'm running to a meeting this afternoon where I chair a group from RESNA, the Rehabilitation Engineering Science in North America, where we're working to develop an opportunity to determine firmness and stability of ground surfaces, whether they be your trail surface or it be a playground surface. Because remember, the standards require that along accessible routes, even into those unique facilities, that you provide an accessible route that's firm and stable, but there's never been any thresholds or any data or information um, to tell you what is firm and stable. I mean, what type of stone or aggregate can I use and compact on a trail or on an accessible route to a boating or fishing facility to still be that firm and stable. So I think surfacing, slip resistance, firmness and stability are issues that is a very gray area. And I would say that at this time, remember that the standards require that elements and spaces on the same site have to be connected by at least one accessible route. And that's a 36-inch route that every 200 feet you go to 5 feet wide so somebody could pass every 200 feet if you're not going to make it 5 foot wide. But that 36-inch path to every one of the single things on your site that are required to be accessible. And then how am I going to facilitate that and what type of surface material with the environmental changes I have, or how am I going to maintain it if it's a loose fill product? Or in a play area, can I use the engineered wood fiber, or can I use a loose fill product, or is it going to have to be a unitary rubber? So I think surfacing is a really big gray area to try to, I think for a lot of recreation professionals of, making sure that I meet that at least one accessible route connecting all elements and spaces on the site required to be accessible. It's really about getting there, right? It's from site arrival and connecting those elements that really make or break a lot of the accessibility features. So much of accessibility laws are just getting there. It doesn't necessarily offer you the opportunity to use everything, but it gets you there. And so I think that's one of the largest gray areas that I continue to work on now, even after leaving the Access Board, to try help people define. So we're working to develop a test method for a device that's called an instrumented surface indenter, where you're going to be able to bring it out into the remote and determine firmness and stability for yourself. And we'll be able to tell you what concrete is and what sand is, and where your organizations decide to be in that continuum between those two. I'd hope it'd be closer to concrete, asphalt, or boards than sand. But it'll give us an idea of how to test loose fill products or recreation type facility accessible routes. And then let organizations decide how firm and how stable it needs to be.
Anyone else?
I could keep going on gray areas because the whole standard's full of them, but that's probably one of the most important ones I think right now in recreation.
Bill, I have another question on that vein. Areas where there's contradicting guidance dimensionally, grades, etc. Where do you see the contradictions in where one guideline says, hey, follow this percentage or that width?
Are we talking edge protection along routes, or
Sections, slopes, route alignments, directness to facilities? There's access to a facility and then there's a recreational trail. Specifically, trails, they're not an access road.
that's an important distinction to understand going into a facility. Are these things we're calling happy trails, are they trails, or are they actually that accessible route requirement where we have to connect everything with at least one? Remember, if you're coming into a site arrival point from a parking lot or a bus stop, or coming in as a pedestrian, from then on, you've got to have that accessible route connecting all elements and spaces. And so if you're using what you're calling a trail to get around the other side of the small pond to get to a fishing pier, that's not a trail. That's going to be an accessible route requirement. Remember, a trail doesn't connect elements and facilities on a site. So a trail is just that, a recreational use facility. If you're connecting elements and spaces on the site with a trail, it changes it from a trail to an accessible route. Even if it's a shared use path, you now changed it from a shared use path to an accessible route. As for edge protection and rails, remember, whenever you're creating routes within a facility, you want to minimize the running slope Remember, cross slope is established at no greater than 2% unless it's a natural surface trail. And then the Architectural Barriers Act gives you up to 5% or 1 in 20 on a cross slope. Typically, the running slopes always, your trigger is at 5%. You go over 5% and you've created a ramp. Not on a trail, but on an accessible route, you've created now a ramp. And so that threshold really we should be trying to maintain in recreation facilities is a running slope or a running grade of under 5%, so we never have to do handrails or edge protection. The idea you can do edge protection without handrails or a guard. Okay, typically in fishing facilities and boating facilities, it says a 2-inch maximum from the ground surface up. And in other areas, it'll talk about, like you're saying there, you can't pass a 4-inch sphere underneath or through, whether they're vertical pickets or you have a bottom horizontal plate. So there is some differences in edge protection about where you're doing it. Again, you can have edge protection without a railing or guard, but once you do a railing, a guard, or a handrail now, and you're over 5%, you've got handrails and edge protection on these accessible routes. We're going to go into more on the pedestrian trail requirements in our second forum and kind of talk the differences between accessible routes, pedestrian trails, and what we call shared use paths, which are hiker-biker. I hope that answered your question.
Got one more over here. Kathy?
Do you provide consulting services? Like if someone, a city wanted to send you their plans, would you look at them and review them or not?
I typically do. I work for the commission, and actually how not only at the ADA symposium last year in Minneapolis, but I've also done work for East Grand Forks, city of East Grand Forks, and the organization Options. So yes, I typically do take in some of that work, but it would just depend on how much of it needed to be done and stuff, if I would be the right person and had the time to do it. So yes, I do contract work and do look at recreation facility plans, playground plans, trails, fishing piers, things like that. Yes, I do. If that's no more questions, I'll just briefly just say that, oh, we got another one?
Hi, Bill. Thank you for presenting today. Wealth of knowledge. So we have a recreational trail bridge that we're going to be working on in a small community. And it's a multi-use trail bridge that we're working on. So it's going to be ATV, snowmobile, pedestrian, and bicycle to connect this community to a lot of services from less populated portion of the city to more of where the businesses are held on the other end. And so when it comes to accessibility, a part of that recreational trail bridge is we're providing a bump out that would provide an opportunity for fishing, kind of an overlook of the river if need be. Are there things to consider when in putting that bump out in place that we need to look into as far as accessibility for wheelchair accessibility, track vehicle accessibility, and even handrail location when it comes to design for that bump out?
Yeah, that's a really neat idea to do that bump out and allow fishing on that overhang or bridge. Remember, you just want to make sure that if you don't put a lot of benches in there that are not movable or restrict the access for somebody to get up close in a mobility device and make sure it's wide enough. I would advocate greater than 5 feet in width of that and a depth of more than 48 inches because that's the minimum clear space. So a depth coming off away from the trail, a minimum of 48 so people can get out of the way, hopefully greater. And then a width or length of that bump out area, I would advocate you want way more than 5 feet if possible. Remember in the fishing requirements, it asks that if you're doing a railing or a guard, that 25% of that area have a handrail height or a guard height no higher than 34 inches. So that's pretty low if it's a high, drop off. But I would try to encourage the railing height, their guard height should be reduced to allow somebody from the seated position or a child to still be able to fish from, but still provide the safety that's needed in that situation. anytime you can provide something that helps hold your pole, like a slanted top plate with a hole in it, so that somebody doesn't have to hold it the whole time, can be helpful. Anytime you can do some kind of a shelf or a bench so that people's tackle boxes don't have to be on the surface, but could be raised up above if it's difficult to reach down that far to get stuff, maybe a fixed shelf or a bench somewhere. Um, the bridge makes sure that the running slope, doesn't exceed 5%, and then hopefully it's level where this bump out is it would be completely level, would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I know you have to run. So we do appreciate your being here today. It was wonderful to hear from you, and we really look forward to working with you in this coming year. Thanks so much.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing, and that is that, hopefully through this initial discussion and discussions in the future, that we can make the parks and trails in Minnesota more accessible and inclusive for everybody to participate. And I look forward, if not meeting you virtually, to someday meet most of you in person.
Thanks a lot.
Have a great meeting.
Thank you. So as you can see, Bill is so knowledgeable. What Joan didn't mention when he was talking about Bill was we kind of stalked him when we met him at the conference. I did. I took every one of his sessions, and you don't realize how little you know about something until you start to learn more about it. So the commissioners felt this was really important also. So it was due to their decision to move forward and put Bill in a contract with us for this coming year that we have his extreme knowledge available to us. So definitely take a look out for those forums that are coming up. He is available to review plans, any of the facilities that you're building with grant funding. He is available to review those plans, give you ideas and tips to go beyond what that minimum is. I always think about Minnesota in the winter and how I like winter activities, but every time I see a street that's not, or a sidewalk that's not shoveled properly, or access from the parking area to the building that's not accessible, it reminds me of how lucky we are that we are mobile, and we should really do more to make sure that people that aren't, or have some sort of impairment that doesn't allow them to enjoy things in the way that able-bodied people can, we really need to go above and beyond. So he's been a terrific resource. And that's the reason why the schedule is a little bit flipped. Normally we would start with a welcome and introductions, but because he had to run to his next meeting and finish up this work he's been doing for the past 3 years, we kind of shoehorned everything in here today. So just to follow up on what we're doing with the inclusivity initiatives at the commission. We did, so out in the front, when you picked up all of your materials, one was an inclusivity statement. And this is simply the commissioner's pledge to all of our park users and trail users and facilities users that we will do our best to help all of our facilities get to the point that everyone can enjoy these facilities in the way that they should be available to all of us. So you'll see our value statement for inclusion, which is pretty simple, but it was worked on with the commissioners over the course of a few months to make sure that we captured the thoughts accurately, and also checked, of course, this with Bill. The Greater Minnesota Regional Parks and Trails Commission believes that nature and outdoor recreation belong to everyone. We are committed to creating and maintaining parks and trails that are accessible, inclusive, and welcoming to all individuals, regardless of their abilities. Our dedication to inclusion reflects our core values of equity and respect for every visitor. So it's a very simple statement, but it's important that we put it out there and we really try to live up to that. And then we have 6 different commitments to that accessibility. And we're hoping that by hiring Bill and making him available, it makes it easier for all of you to just go to that one above. When I called Bill a couple of months ago to say, we're talking about picnic tables and facilities, and what do you think if we had 12 tables in a pavilion, how many do you think should be accessible, have that overhang? And without any hesitation, he said, well, why would you just make some of them accessible? They should all be accessible, which I was embarrassed to say it was this huge light bulb that went up, but of course, I mean, it's not like that we're paying double for this. It's a very simple, inexpensive thing to do to make sure that everybody can enjoy that. Because his point was often those tables, if they're not adhered to a surface permanently, they get moved around. So it may be that those two accessible table overhangs are stuffed off in a corner and you can't get to them anyways and enjoy them. So those are the sorts of things that when he said that, I felt silly. A light bulb went off and I realized even more that, you know, what you don't know, you don't know. So this was all part of our work to make sure that we're doing universal design, that we're offering inclusive experiences for everyone, that we're doing community engagement too, to learn what might be helpful that we don't understand about our users, and that we're offering education and training in our facilities so that staff and volunteers really understand the importance, and it's looked at as something we want to do rather than something we have to do. And it's a problem because it's not. And then there's the connection to nature and outdoors to make sure that we can facilitate people's enjoyment of that. We did offer track wheelchair grants a few years ago. And we got a great deal on those track wheelchairs, and we opened up a competitive grant process for that. We had 3 applicants. We had the funding for 2 track wheelchairs, and the commissioners made a decision that we had operating funds available in our budget because that's separate from the grant dollars. So we paid for that 3rd chair as well, so that there wasn't 2 winners and 1 loser. Everybody got to win and all those users got to win. So that's very important also. And also that we're just doing continuous improvement. So again, hiring Bill and having him available to us and to you, more importantly, is all part of that process of continuous improvement. So with that, we will move along. We're running a little bit ahead, which is unusual. I'm sure we're going to fall behind shortly here. Is there anything anyone else needs to know about that, wants to know about that, or feels might be helpful? Gina.
I'm just wondering if the commitment is going to impact any of the requirements.
Gina wanted to know if the commitments are going to impact any of the requirements the commission has. And I would say that at this point, no, but we're looking at that to provide some guidance. Again, those ADA standards, it's funny when you hear someone say that they're a C, you know, it's a barely passing grade. We'd like to exceed that, but there's nothing that we're working on at this moment that's going to happen. That'll be a conversation as we move forward, though. I think, just touching on the grant abilities, we do, if you notice, I'm sure you've all been poring over all their funding applications, which you got to open up at April 1 this year. We do have a carve out to assist with meeting ADA standards, exceeding those standards, helping facilities get to a point of improvements. So there will be dollars available on a revolving basis for you to apply to enhance your facilities. It's not a huge amount of money. We're still working to see what the dollars look like, but it's going to be in excess of $100,000. So do be thinking about that when they launch. Of course, Joel let all of you know that grant is out there, but it can be things as simple as automatic door openers. You know, you think of yourself coming into a building and you're carrying an armful of things and trying to kick the door open with your foot. Well, at least you have that foot available to kick the door open with, but you know, just even making those door openers automatic to get people into a building is going to be a step forward. So that grant opportunity will be out there again on a revolving basis, and we'll let you know about that soon. Yes, Carmen.
So will it allow us to record the forums so that we can
Yes.
post them on our website?
Yes. The forums will be recorded and posted on GMPT website as well as the GMRPTC website so that everyone can listen to that. Absolutely.